Muskogee, Oklahoma, is a city with a population of fewer than 40,000 people, offering a distinctly rural atmosphere. The homes are spaced out and set apart from one another, and the 900 block of Indiana Street is no different. This case begins at 1:30 a.m. on Tuesday, February 2nd, 2021, when a 911 call was made. Muskogee authorities are accustomed to dealing with crime, despite the city's seemingly quiet appearance. In fact, it has one of the highest crime rates in America. The likelihood of becoming a victim of either violent or property crime in Muskogee is 1 in 24. However, nothing could have prepared officers for what they were about to encounter. The man who had made the 911 call requested an ambulance before handing the phone to a woman who was clearly losing consciousness. The authorities were now in a race against time. As they arrived at the scene, they saw a young man calmly leaving the property. When they got onto the street, they saw a young man calmly leaving the property. He was covering his face and holding a gun. He stood there for a minute, not responding to the officers and staring blankly. He suddenly darted away and ran off into the night. One of the officers fired at him, but they missed, and a chase was now underway. They finally managed to catch up to him, and he was placed under arrest. The man was 25-year-old Jaron Dijon Pridgeon, and he was not only the suspect in the shootings, he was also the person that made the call to 911 in the first place. Officers were now moving through the home, and it was painfully silent. The woman Jaron had passed the phone to was 27-year-old Brittany Anderson, and she was clinging to life. Paramedics said her injuries were life-threatening, and they feared the worst as they waited for a helicopter to take her to hospital. As they moved through the home, they found a young man and 4 of Brittany's small children. They had all been shot to death. Another one of her children was badly injured and fighting for their life too. Brittany had 8 children in total, and her 3 other children were inside the house too. There was a 7-year-old, a 1-year-old, and a 1-month-old. Thankfully, they were unharmed and taken away to the Oklahoma Department of Human Services, before later reuniting with their grandparents. The helicopter arrived and airlifted Brittany and her young child to a Tulsa hospital, about 40 miles away. Brittany was whisked away to the ICU with swelling and bleeding on her brain. Tragically, her child that had gone with her passed away shortly after arriving. How on earth had 6 young lives been taken within seconds? There was so much commotion and speculation, and concerned neighbors gathered outside, looking for answers about their friends. Brittany Anderson lived in the home with her 8 children, and Jaron, their suspect, was the father of 5 of them. Jaron was Brittany's ex, and he would come and go, never staying in the home for long periods of time. As the victims were identified, police began releasing their names to the media and public. The young man that had been shot was Jaron's 24-year-old brother, Javerian. The children were 1-year-old Jaliyah, just 6 days away from her 2nd birthday, Jadi's, who was 3, 5-year-old Harmony, 6-year-old Nevaeh, and Brittany's eldest child, 9-year-old Cadence. Jaron was the father to Jillia, Jadi's, Nevaeh, the 1-year-old child, and the 1-month-old baby. Brittany's family hadn't lived in the neighborhood long, but residents said they already fit right in. All the children were often out playing in the street or the park, and mingling with the other kids well, making friends fast. Cadence was Brittany's eldest child and only son. He was full of energy and wanted to play football when he was older. Nevaeh was said to be cheeky and a little diva, and would often joke with her aunt about taking her to her nail salon. Harmony loved to make people laugh and was called the smiley one. Jadi's was smart, loyal, and fiercely protective of her siblings. And 1-year-old Jaliyah was described as a dream baby, never crying at anyone she met, and just wanting to be picked up and held by everyone. The siblings were close, and although they were also different, they shared the same love of being outdoors and creating imaginary adventures together. They all had a tradition of saying goodbye with a high 2, high 5, and a fist bump. Jaliyah couldn't do the high 2 yet, so she did a high 1 instead. Jaron was already in custody and, understandably, being held without bond. He was totally emotionless and uncooperative, providing no reason for his rampage. Jaron had a long rap sheet, including burglary, assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, obstructing and resisting an officer, and possession of a controlled dangerous substance. In 2019, he was charged after he attacked a woman by throwing slabs of concrete at her. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 10 years, but this was deferred on account of a mental health evaluation, and instead, he was placed on probation for 3 years. It was a crime so cruel it was beyond comprehension, and everybody collectively felt so much anger and pain for the family. Authorities said it will go down as the most heinous crime in modern city history. I've been with this agency for 16 years and have not had anything to this magnitude during my time that I've been on, the police department spokesperson Lynn Hamlin said. Flowers and balloons started lining the front of the home, and a lot of the children in the area took their toys over as well, laying them outside for their friends they had now lost. I feel bad for the mother that lost her children, so I decided I would grab a couple of stuffed animals and bring them here, one young girl told the cameras. A day after the shooting, numerous people gathered in a park outside the Muskogee Civic Center to sing and pray for the family. The mayor said the shootings had already taken such a toll on the community, but they were rallying together in a way he had never seen. Restaurants were bringing people food for free, and agencies across Oklahoma were offering support teams and therapy dogs. Mayor Coleman said, "I can't even describe how I'm feeling. For me, as the leader of this city, as well as the pastor of a church that Brittany and her sisters frequently attended when they were kids, grief would be an understatement. Many of us went to bed resting in anticipation of tomorrow's hopes, only to have awakened to know that 5 babies, with unlimited potential, are no longer with us. Their lives taken prematurely, their families grappling with a new horror, and our community paralyzed with grief. Miraculously, and against all the odds, Brittany was recovering. She was now awake, sitting up and talking. But the young mother then soon had to face the devastating reality that was now her life. 5 of her children had been murdered. She told police that that night was all such a blur and everything had happened so fast. She said she had told Jaron he could visit the kids as he was on his way to Texas, and he would be passing through. She said the last thing she remembered was Jaron saying he would never hurt her. Moments later, she said he snapped and fired the gun right at her face. "I was in and out of consciousness, but I knew that I was attacked first," she said. "I seen Jaron walking in from the kitchen saying, 'I shouldn't have done that,'" she added. Brittany recalled as the paramedics came in. She heard them saying deceased kids, and it just didn't register. Nothing about what had happened to her family registered for days. The community was still supporting them in every way they could, and a fund was set up to help cover the funeral costs. It raised a staggering $45,000 on February 13th. All 5 children were laid to rest, but residents knew it would bring little peace or closure. He said he planned to sign a proclamation in the next few days to make the month of March Community Care Month for first responders. Several first responders were getting counseling because of the shooting, and he wanted the community to support them as well during this time. Paramedics said they actually knew the house, with some of the team having a personal connection to the family. They said that that day will be something that will stick with them forever. And as much as you can prepare for traumatic calls, no one can be prepared for something like that. 25-year-old Jaron Pridgeon soon appeared in court to answer for his heinous actions. He was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of shooting with intent to kill, and 1 count of possession of firearms after conviction or during probation. The prosecution is seeking the death penalty, but the judge requested that he undergo psychiatric evaluation before anything else could go ahead. And with delays due to the pandemic, things were slow. In May 2023, it was announced that Jaron would be changing his plea from not guilty to not guilty by reason of insanity. The trial was then given a start date of October 2023. But due to yet more delays, it likely won't go ahead as planned. Even 2 years later, he still says nothing about what happened that morning and what drove him to do it. He's not a person. He is a monster. And on top of being a monster, he is a coward for doing what he did, Brittany's sister Raven said. The pain that Brittany must live with is unimaginable. She is surrounded by a strong and supportive family, and the community and everybody around her is working to help her rebuild her life as best she can. She said she has an overwhelming feeling of survivor's guilt and believes that she should be gone too. But she has to stay strong for her 3 surviving children. Brittany says her house feels so empty now and any sense of normalcy is gone. The laughter, happiness, and joy no longer exist. And she says, without the pitter-patter of so many tiny feet, she lives in a very quiet and lonely place, physically and emotionally. Discover the chilling world of secret crime mysteries, where we delve into the most perplexing cold cases and unsolved crimes. Join us as we unravel hidden clues and explore haunting mysteries. Subscribe now and be part of the journey to bring these cases to light. Friday, November 25th, 2022. Thanksgiving weekend, 6:58 a.m. Riverside, California, in a small cul-de-sac on Price Court. It was a peaceful morning that Friday. Most families were still resting, having enjoyed delicious food and good company the night before Thanksgiving. For many, the weekend would continue in a similar fashion, eating well, unwinding, and spending time with loved ones. Just before 7 a.m., a red Kia Soul pulled into the area, and a man dressed in a tan trench coat, black fedora, and face mask, carrying a black duffel bag and a plastic bag, stepped out. He wandered around the neighborhood for a while, standing outside a house briefly before returning to his car and driving off. He repeated the same behavior twice. One of the neighbors found it odd enough to call the Riverside Police's non-emergency line and report the license plate. However, since nothing had actually happened, the police could only make a note of the information. 2 hours later, at 9 a.m., Michelle Blandon was about to leave her house when she received a call from her mother, Sherry. Sherry was frantic, speaking quickly. She explained that a detective was at her house and wanted to speak with her 15-year-old granddaughter, Michelle's niece. He said something had happened near the school and it was very urgent that he get hold of her. 65-year-old Sherry lived in the home with her husband, 69-year-old Mark, a volunteer high school softball and baseball coach, her daughter, 38-year-old Brooke, and Brooke's 2 young girls. Everyone's minds were racing. Had the teen done something wrong? Was she in trouble? Was he going to take her to the station? Sherry said it was just her and Mark in the house as Brooke had taken her girls out. The officer said he would have to wait until they came home and interview everyone separately. It seemed really serious. Michelle was baffled and worried but reassured her mother it was probably nothing and to try and stay calm. Sherry asked the detective if it was okay for Brooke's other daughter to get dropped off at Michelle's house while they sorted everything out, and he agreed. All everyone could do was wait until the teen came home with Brooke. The detective told Sherry that he needed to talk to the adults first and the teen would have to wait in the car once she got there, along with both hers and Brooke's phones. Michelle's heart started to beat fast and the anxious feeling she had was growing. None of this felt right or normal, not even close. But Michelle knew her mom wouldn't have opened the door for anyone, let alone let someone in. He was an officer. He had a badge and the authority to go in and everything would be fine. A few minutes later, Brooke arrived at her house to drop off her niece, and Michelle watched as Brooke and her 15-year-old daughter drove off to Price Court. Michelle called Sherry back and said they were on their way over and asked if everything was okay. Sherry's voice was shaky and she was fighting back tears. She said the detective was still in the house, but before she could say anything else, he took the phone off her. Calming and reassuring, he said, "I'm here with your mom. She is kind of being anxious and freaking out. Everything is gonna be okay. It's all okay." He passed the phone back over and Michelle strained to hear what was being said. She heard the detective say as part of the investigation that he needed to search the teen's room. The room with the Green Bay Packers memorabilia, he said. Michelle felt sick. How on earth did he know what the inside of her family's house looked like? But before she could say anything to her mother, Sherry said, "I'll call you back." And the line went dead. There was nothing Michelle could do but wait, so she tried to shake it off and headed out into town. Brooke finally pulled up and went inside, her daughter staying in the car as per the officer's instructions. A short while later, Michelle sent a text to her mom asking for an update. She got no reply. 11 o'clock and 8 seconds a.m. 911 dispatchers received a call requesting that a welfare check be carried out at Price Court. A couple of residents were concerned as they had watched a man leaving a house with a much younger girl who was very distressed. She had no shoes on and was subtly trying to mouth words at people watching, although they couldn't tell what she was trying to communicate. The pair walked towards a red Kia Soul, which was parked on someone's drive. The same person's drive, in fact, that had reported the car's license plates just a few hours earlier. As the pair approached the car, the owner of the house opened the door and shouted at the man that he couldn't park there. The man was very apologetic and said he was leaving. He opened the back passenger side door and the girl got inside. He then walked around to the back door on the driver's side and put the black duffel bag inside. As he turned around, the neighbor saw some red spots on his clothes which looked like blood, but she couldn't be sure. Although the girl wasn't physically forced into the car, something was very troubling about the situation. Before the man shut the doors, the girl quietly whispered, "Help me," and the car sped away. Michelle, who was still out in town, then got a Facebook message from a neighbor of her parents. "Please call me ASAP," it read. A few minutes later, more calls came flooding into the Riverside Police Department. A house was on fire at Price Court. It was Mark and Sherry's. Michelle jumped in the car with her husband and they started heading across town. She was calling her mom, dad, and sister repeatedly, but no one was picking up. Price Court, authorities were now there and tackling the blaze. The windows were starting to smash because of the heat and the roof was caving in. As firefighters made it inside, they found the bodies of Mark, Sherry, and Brooke lying closely together near the front door. They all had plastic bags over their heads and were bound and gagged. They were already dead and their neighbors watched in horror as they were pulled from the home. Michelle and her husband pulled up to her parents' house just after this, and Michelle tried to run through the tape as the police dragged her back. Her parents' and sister's cars were still parked outside, and although it was too early to tell who had been inside, Michelle soon heard that several bodies had already been carried out. As a shaken Michelle headed to the station with the police, other officers were trying to track down the red Kia. Michelle told them about the strange phone calls that morning and the detective inside her parents' house. She said there was no way the man would have got inside the house without showing some form of ID. Sherry would never have let him in without this, no matter what he said. Police were still not confirming anything, but when Michelle told them about her father's 2 tattoos on each arm, a Green Bay Packers logo on his left and a Notre Dame mascot on his right, she was faced with a situation that she had somehow been trying to rationalize and come up with excuses for. Her mother, father, and sister were inside the house and her niece was now missing. Despite people wondering if the fire had caused their deaths, an autopsy would later reveal that Mark, Sherry, and Brooke had all likely died of asphyxiation. They had been bound and gagged before plastic bags were put over their heads and Brooke's throat had been slashed. Mark was killed first and they could see from the injuries that Brooke had really tried hard to fight off the attacker. 3 of the family's dogs would also die in the fire, along with their pet bird. Their 4th dog, which had been in the backyard at the time, survived and went into a shelter whilst a new home was found. For the small, quiet community and everyone that knew the family, it was impossible to believe that anything like this could happen on their doorsteps. Around the same time all of this was going on, over 2,000 miles away in Virginia, a woman was filing a missing persons report. Her boyfriend of 5 years had taken off and now she couldn't get hold of him. The couple had been celebrating Thanksgiving together in San Diego for a few days with her parents when he suddenly started packing to leave. He said he had run out of vacation time and needed to drive back to Virginia where he had just purchased a house. But the drive would take over a day and this hadn't been their plan. Little did she know, he hadn't set off to Virginia. He had set off for Riverside, California. And she would soon realize it was her boyfriend that was now on the run with the missing 15-year-old girl. Using the license plate the neighbor had previously given them, police in Riverside were finally able to track down the red Kia as it was heading into Kelso, an unincorporated area of San Bernardino County. On a totally empty and rural road, far away from anything, they caught up to the car and a SWAT team and helicopter were in pursuit. The man finally pulled over and jumped out of the car, firing his gun. He showed no signs of backing down. A shootout ensued with the man as the girl ran from the car. In a matter of seconds, the driver was dead and the teen was with the police. Most reports state that he had turned the gun on himself, but some say he was killed by police fire. The 15-year-old, who to this day has never been named, was alive and unharmed. She was taken into protective custody before they began interviewing her. She and her sister also began a lengthy process of trauma counseling, and a GoFundMe raised over $100,000 which would be given to the girls. Upon hearing that she had been found alive, Michelle commended the neighbor for being so diligent in reporting the number plate and for persisting they look into it. She believes it absolutely saved her niece's life. The man who had kidnapped her and killed her family was 28-year-old Austin Lee Edwards, a serving Virginia State Deputy Sheriff. To the authorities' surprise, the teen said she did actually know Austin, having met him online. But he was not the person she thought he was. The pair had started speaking on Omegle, a free online chat site that allows people to socialize with others without the need to register or create an account. The site randomly pairs users in one-on-one chat sessions where they talk anonymously using the names you and stranger. She had been honest about her age, but Austin had told her that he was 17. It is unknown what, if any, pictures he was using or who he was pretending to be. The police couldn't determine how long they had actually been talking for or how he had got hold of her address. But at some point, Austin had asked her for photographs that were sexual in nature. She said after this, she stopped talking to him. Detectives theorized that maybe he killed her family in retaliation, or he thought that if he kidnapped her, he could stop her from talking to anyone. They also couldn't rule out the possibility that he did have some explicit photos of her, and maybe this was an attempt at sextortion. His messages showed he was clearly obsessed and was going to stop at nothing. But with more than 1 million pages of social media content to go through, it was safe to say the full story would take some time to come to light. The teen told police that morning that she had no idea what was going on as she and Brooke pulled up to the house. She said she had waited in the car following Brooke's instructions, but it ended up getting too hot. She took her shoes off and stood outside for some air before tentatively walking inside the house to see what was going on. As soon as she went through the door, the first thing she saw was her grandmother, Sherry, with a bag over her head and her hands tied. She was still moving slightly. Before she had time to process anything, Austin appeared and pointed a gun at her and ordered that she leave with him. It is unknown where he was driving her or what, if any, conversations took place in his car. And Austin was now dead and couldn't answer for himself. So who was he and what did they know about him? 28-year-old Austin Edwards had joined the police academy in July 2021. And after graduating a year later, he went to Henrico County within the Richmond Division of Virginia. He resigned from the department after a couple of months, but no reason could be given for him leaving as it was not in his personnel file. A month after leaving, Austin was still associated with the Washington County Sheriff's Office and stepped into the patrol division as a Virginia State Deputy Sheriff. A little under 2 weeks before he drove to California, in a small town of less than 2,000 people, Austin had purchased a new home. Neighbors said he was friendly and they felt safe around him, knowing he was a police officer, feeling a certain level of protection from him. Austin spent a lot of time blacking out all the windows in his home. But less than 10 days after moving in, Austin Lee Edwards, the Winnecks and their pets would all be dead in another state. As the investigation was unraveling, over in Washington, one woman was scrolling aimlessly on Instagram when she landed on a picture that made her freeze. It was a photo of Austin. Not only was the story his face was attached to horrific, she had her own story from years ago. She had met Austin on Omegle too. He was 20, she just 13, and he had groomed, stalked, and harassed her for years. She almost threw up when she saw him. I read the whole story and it made me feel disgusting, she said. Seeing everything that had happened to the Winnick family over in California, the now 21-year-old took her story to the police and was able to offer up almost 4,000 messages between the pair from years ago. Austin had started off sweet and chatty, and she told him right away that she was 13, but this did not deter him from talking to her. He soon started asking for nude photographs and told her he loved her. He often spoke about hurting himself as a way of release. On one occasion, he insisted she join him on Skype. "I can't yet," she told him. "Why is that?" He replied, "Because my mom," she said. "Kill her. I'ma give myself a black eye. Okay?" He replied, "Listen, there's no obstacle that's gonna stop us from being together if that's what we both want. It doesn't even matter if you're 14 and not technically allowed to do shit yet," he said. She eventually cut ties with him, but this didn't stop him trying to get hold of her. Another thing that the messages brought to light was something serious that had happened in 2016. 2 weeks after the teen had told him she didn't want to talk to him, Austin had been detained for psychiatric evaluation after threatening to take his own life and kill his father. Police had been called to the home by Austin's dad, Christopher. They found him trying to restrain Austin on the kitchen floor, which was covered in blood, and Christopher had bite marks all over his arms. Police pulled out a taser, but Christopher said he could handle it, still trying to protect his son. Eventually, Austin was handcuffed, strapped to a stretcher, and checked into a hospital. He said he had had an argument with his girlfriend and was lashing out. His girlfriend being the 14-year-old who was trying to get away from him. Despite blocking him on every account, he made new ones and always found a way to reach her. The harassment went on for years until she was 18, when it all abruptly stopped. It is unknown whether this coincided with meeting the 15-year-old online, but investigations show the timings match up for this to be a possibility. Upon sending him to a mental health hospital in 2016, the judge said there was a substantial likelihood, as a result of mental illness, he will, in the near future, seriously harm himself or suffer harm. The incident also prompted the judge to strip him of his gun rights. Under Virginia law, anyone who is held on a temporary detention order and later admitted to a treatment facility is not allowed to buy or possess a firearm until that right has been restored by the courts. His gun rights were never restored. On his application to the academy, Austin disclosed that he had voluntarily checked himself into a mental health facility, which meant he had to undergo a mental health evaluation and exam. He failed. Austin used his father, a close friend, and his Virginia State Police field training officer as references for the academy. And despite the failed evaluations and the fact the court had taken his gun rights away, he was still accepted. The Virginia State Police deliberately buried the results of this mental health examination, did no further examination into this aspect of Edwards' application, and hired him, a notice said. Arte Civito, the interim police chief for the Aurora, Colorado Police Department, and a nationally recognized policing expert said, "I'd have to ask a lot of questions about why he's moving so quickly. That's pretty unusual for someone to go through academy and all of a sudden turn around and leave." He said most departments would be unlikely to hire Austin after such a brief work history unless he enrolled in their own police academy. With all of this coming to light, Michelle and her family wanted answers, but they weren't getting any. The Washington County Sheriff said, "It is shocking and sad to the entire law enforcement community that such an evil and wicked person could infiltrate law enforcement while concealing his true identity as a computer predator and murderer." But the Virginia State Police said he didn't ever display any red flags. He was the nicest person and loved helping people in his job. They said he had no reprimands, no complaints, no instances of use of force levied, no internal investigations, and no disciplinary investigations. Michelle said that not one department ever apologized or even acknowledged them for a period of time. Eventually, Virginia State Police would issue a statement and say it was an isolated incident, adding human error resulted in an incomplete database query during Edwards' hiring process. They said that if they knew about his past, he wouldn't have been hired. Riverside Police Chief Larry Gonzalez said, "It's disturbing. It's disgusting. Anybody in the law enforcement community, we hate that person more than anybody because it's a reflection on us. This is yet another horrific reminder of the predators existing online who prey on our children. If you've already had a conversation with your kids on how to be safe online and on social media, have it again. If not, start now to better protect them." After all of these failings were highlighted, Governor Glenn Youngkin requested a full investigation be carried out by the state's watchdog agency. An agreement with the watchdog agency later allowed Virginia State Police to investigate themselves. Michelle and her family filed a notice of intent to sue in relation to the hiring process of Austin and the failures that had ensued. She said, "We want to know why this person was able to get hired by not one but two agencies and given a firearm when he couldn't legally buy one." Her attorneys said Austin's employers demonstrated negligence, gross negligence, negligence and gross negligent hiring, breach of mandatory duties, and other violations of Virginia state law. They argued that the family's damages exceeded $100 million even though Austin is now dead and cannot give anyone any information. Police say they are continuing to look into his past, his laptop, and his phones to determine if he has any more victims and piece together more of his story. But with so many pages of messages from only 2 people so far, police say they could be unraveling things for years and might never know the full truth. Mark, Sherry, and Brooke, along with their beloved pets, died in the most frightening of ways, terrified and trying to protect each other. Michelle said, "They all lived and loved selflessly." Mark was dearly loved by the kids he coached, and he left a big impact on many, with some saying he shaped their futures and what they wanted to do when they were older. He would always make sure he checked on them from time to time to see if everything was going well for them in college. The school paid tribute to him as well. His neighbor said he was someone that never stopped and loved being busy. He would offer to mow people's lawns to help them out and to pass the time. Sherry loved nothing more than being with her family. Celebrations like Thanksgiving and Christmas were her favorite times of year, when everyone could just be together, and she would bake cakes and cookies for her children and grandchildren. "We had a family debate, and it got heated on if the brownies my mom made should be frosted with sprinkles or just left plain," Michelle said. "Little did I know on that day, that would be the last time my husband and I would see my parents and sister again." Brooke was a single parent, and Michelle said her biggest joys in life were watching her 2 girls grow and collecting Starbucks cups. Michelle laughed. Brooke was telling everyone that her daughter had joined the color guard at school, and nothing made her prouder than watching her. For the girls and Michelle who were left behind, it is impossible to imagine how they must find each day. Celebrations such as birthdays, Christmas, and Thanksgiving will never be the same, and what should be such a happy time to be with each other will always serve as a painful reminder of what was taken from them. In a touching tribute, Price Court in Riverside was ceremoniously renamed Winnick Court and is placed next to the Winnick's home. Eric, Mark's nephew and godson, said, "Mark and Sherry's pride and joy were their kids, and by extension their grandchildren. You never saw them beam so brightly than when they were around their family." 79-year-old Joe Roy McMillan from Carthage, Texas, went missing on May 21, 2020. The last confirmed sighting of him was at Ted's Saw Shop on FM 1970 near Clayton, Texas. During the investigation, several pieces of surveillance footage were uncovered, mostly from gas station cameras, showing Joe's blue 2004 GMC Sierra, primarily traveling south on Route 59. The final recorded sighting placed him in Livingston, Texas, over 100 miles south of his Carthage home. Authorities speculated that Joe might have been heading toward the Houston area, where he had family. This unplanned trip may also have been due to complications from a health condition. Joe was diabetic, and his family also feared that he was beginning to show signs of dementia. On August 6, 2020, authorities in Brazoria County, Texas were working in a bayou near the town of Freeport to remove 2 vehicles from the water. The site was just after a sharp turn in a nearby road, and accidents were common there. While they were there to retrieve 2 vehicles known to have gone off the road and into the water the night before, they unexpectedly found a 3rd vehicle, a blue 2004 GMC Sierra. Joe's remains were inside of the vehicle. While the circumstances of the vehicle's discovery indicated that Joe was killed after his car accidentally went off the road and into the water, the Texas Rangers still processed the scene. No signs of foul play were found. Joe is laid to rest during a private funeral service. He is survived by his wife of 60 years, Bonnie Sue, 3 children, 3 grandchildren, and a great-granddaughter. We are saddened by the confirmation, but at the same time, we're just glad to finally have some answers and to get some closure for all that has happened, Joe's grandson, Michael McMillan, told KLTV. Richelle Thomas Stubblefield was a gifted athlete, attending Calumet College of St. Joseph in Whiting, Indiana on a track and field scholarship. She had to take a step back from running in 2015 when she became pregnant. She was expecting a boy whom she planned to name Amir Deshaun Thomas Stubblefield. Her due date, December 15th, was just 10 days before her own birthday on Christmas Day. In 2015, she would have turned 21. November 10th, 2015 started out as a normal day for Richelle. She went to her classes and then attended a women's basketball game in the evening. The game was the last place she was seen. When her family stopped hearing from her, they reported her missing on November 12th. After Richelle disappeared, some of her friends reported to police that she had been planning to go to Gary, Indiana to visit the father of her unborn son. It does appear that Richelle made it to Gary as her car was found abandoned in the 1800 block of Martin Luther King Drive there, and her shoes and broken eyeglasses were found in the same area. By 2020, authorities were confident enough that the man Richelle was going to see was involved in her disappearance to arrest him. 25-year-old Durn Fuller was arrested in July of 2020 and charged with 1 count of obstruction of justice and 2 counts of murder, 1 for Richelle and 1 for her unborn son. At the time of his arrest, he was a member of the 19th Engineer Battalion at Fort Knox in Kentucky. He had joined the Army in January of 2016, 2 months after Richelle's disappearance. After he was taken into custody in Kentucky, he was extradited back to Indiana. While Fuller is charged with murdering Richelle, her body has not been recovered. Court documents related to Fuller's arrest revealed new information about the investigation into Richelle's disappearance and seemed to confirm that Fuller was the person in interest in the case who was being investigated, but not publicly discussed by police in 2015. Fuller was interviewed by authorities in November of 2015 and told them he did not know where Richelle was, but she had talked to him about going to Atlanta. He denied being her boyfriend or the father of her unborn child. He said he knew Richelle had told her mother that he was, but that he didn't know why. 10 days after Richelle was last seen, police in Indiana received a tip from police in Illinois. 2 of Fuller's cousins had come forward claiming that he had confessed to them during a phone call that he had killed a woman who was 8 months pregnant with his child. He was afraid of being asked to pay child support and therefore choked her and stabbed her in her temple. He then buried her body behind Williams Elementary School in Gary. 3 days later, Fuller was taken into custody at the home of another woman with whom he was romantically involved. When she was interviewed by police, she told them that she had picked Fuller up from the track at Williams Elementary School after he called her and asked for a ride. He told her that something had happened to Richelle and that he was responsible for it. The grounds of the elementary school were searched with cadaver dogs twice, once in August of 2016 and once in January of 2017. During the second search, the dogs indicated that there were human remains present on a hillside behind the school, but nothing was found when police began digging up the area. In August of 2019, Butler's girlfriend from 2015 was now his ex-girlfriend, and she was living in Texas. Investigators traveled there to speak to her again, promising her immunity from prosecution in the case. During this interview, she stated that Fuller had been throwing items that belonged to Richelle out of the car window as they drove away from the elementary school, and that he told her he killed Richelle by choking her. Fuller's defense attorney has said that he finds it odd that his client was arrested in 2020 when police have not found any new significant information. Their reasoning will hopefully become clear as the case progresses. Richelle's body still has not been found. On June 13, 1993, a woman called the property manager for her apartment on Pillsbury Avenue in Minneapolis, Minnesota to complain that water was leaking into her unit. The manager determined that the water was coming from a certain apartment in the building, but no one answered the door when he went to it. After he let himself in, he found that the source of the water was the shower which had been left running. He also found a large amount of blood in the nude body of 35-year-old Genie Childers. She had been stabbed multiple times. Genie was a sex worker who brought clients back to this apartment, which was rented by her boyfriend who had been out of state at the time of her murder. Her case went cold, but several items were collected from the scene. Eventually, they were tested for DNA. A DNA profile was developed from sperm cells on items from the scene and from 2 other non-sperm cell fraction samples taken from Genie's towel and comforter. This DNA profile was not found in any criminal databases, but in 2018, it was run through a commercial DNA site, and genetic genealogy was used to identify a suspect who had been living in Minneapolis at the time of the murder. That suspect was placed under surveillance, and in early 2019, authorities followed him to a hockey game. There, they witnessed him eat a hot dog and wipe his mouth with a napkin. When he threw the napkin away, they collected it. The DNA found on the napkin was a match to the DNA from the crime scene. The suspect was 52-year-old Jerry Westrom, a married father of 3. He was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in February 2019. A direct DNA sample was then taken from him and confirmed the DNA match. Speaking with police after his arrest, Westrom denied any involvement in Genie's murder. He further claimed that he had never even been in that apartment or that apartment complex. When he was shown a picture of Genie, Westrom said he did not recognize her and claimed that he had not had sex with any woman in Minneapolis in 1993. He could not explain why his DNA was at the scene. He posted bail and was released. Westrom, with the support of his family, maintains his innocence. His lawyer has claimed that the evidence against his client is thin because some of the DNA came from sperm and the victim was a sex worker. In April of 2019, authorities announced that another piece of evidence tied Westrom to the scene, a bare footprint left in Genie's blood, which was a match to Westrom's footprint. Westrom was originally charged with second-degree murder at the time of his 2019 arrest. However, on June 25, 2020, a grand jury indicted him for first-degree premeditated murder in the case. He turned himself in to the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office the following Monday. With the charge increased, a judge also increased his bail to $2 million up from the $500,000 it had been set at following his initial arrest on a second-degree charge in 2019. He was able to post it and was released on July 16th. At the end of July 2020, Westrom's trial date was finally set for April 19, 2021. Hearings in the case were originally delayed because the defense was waiting for evidence in the case, which Westrom's lawyer says they are still waiting for. Proceedings have now been delayed due to the ongoing pandemic. Ronan was born in November 2005 at New Cross Hospital, the second child of parents Chanda and Pooja, joining his older sister Nikita. He attended Lanesfield Primary School before moving on to Calzer Academy, Wolverhampton. In 2012, his parents separated, and they would divorce 5 years later. But Chanda noted that it was Ronan who played a key role in helping them reconcile. Nikita shared that she had never met anyone so caring, loving, bright, and popular, describing her little brother as having a massive heart. Ronan's compassion for others was clear in the way he treated people. If he saw someone struggling on the street, he would always offer money and show them kindness and respect. At 16 years old, Ronan was considered the heart and soul of his family. He had a fantastic sense of humor and enjoyed playing pranks and practical jokes. A devoted Liverpool Football Club fan, he also loved watching Netflix and playing on his PlayStation. Ronan could spend hours drawing anime and enjoyed being at home so much that his friends often had to encourage him to go out. On June 29, 2022, a bright summer day in Wolverhampton, Ronan had just completed his GCSE exams 5 days earlier and was excited to start a new chapter in life. He planned to study sociology, psychology, and law at a level, with dreams of becoming a lawyer one day. He was also excited to go on the family's first holiday out of the United Kingdom. At around 4:30 p.m., Chanda gave his son and his son's friends a lift to the Midland Snooker Club on Oxford Street in Bilston. This was a place Ronan had been going to with his family since he was a child, and they would also enjoy meals out there. Before leaving, Pooja gave her son a kiss, told him he looked handsome and waved goodbye as they set off. At 7:30 p.m., Ronan called his father to ask if he could pick him up and give him a lift home. After getting back to his house on Mount Road, he later set off again to buy a PlayStation controller from a friend. His dad then phoned him and offered to pick him up, but Ronan declined and said he would instead walk home. He put his headphones on, started his music, and set off. 8:56 p.m. Chanda's phone rang. It was Pooja. She had been in Wolverhampton City Center at her weekly meditation class. She asked him what was happening on Mount Road after hearing that it had been closed off and police had swarmed the area. Chandler went outside and neighbors had started to gather on the street. There were police and emergency services everywhere. He was told that somebody had been stabbed. He said he rang Ronan more than 10 times, but each time it rang out and went to voicemail. He then told a police officer on the scene that his son had not come home. They were shown a picture of Ronan, and one of the paramedics said they were treating someone who did look like him, and tragically it was. When Pooja arrived home, she begged the officers, "Please let me see him one time. He will wake up for his mum." but they said no. At the age of just 16, Ronan Kanda died at the scene, just 2 doors away from his house. Chanda was inconsolable and needed to be comforted by neighbors. When Pooja found out she was shattered, as was Nikita, who was on holiday in Crete at the time, a murder investigation was launched. One of the first things the police did was look at the network of CCTV cameras from around the area to try and piece together what had happened in Ronan's final moments. This would give them their first major breakthrough. 2 males were seen brandishing both a ninja sword and a machete, running towards where Ronan was. The cameras then picked up Ronan's scream as he was viciously stabbed. As the investigations into the footage continued, someone handed themselves into the police after confessing to his mother and uncle that he had been involved. His name was Sukhman Shergill, and he could be seen on the footage alongside Prabjit Vidisa. The 2 were arrested. Also arrested were 20-year-old Josiah Francis and 18-year-old Joseph Whitaker. Pravjit and Sukhman were charged with murder on a joint enterprise basis, meaning that someone could be charged with the crime of someone else if they foresaw the other person was likely to commit said offense. They denied the charge of murder but admitted to carrying a bladed article. Josiah Francis and Joseph Whitaker were also charged with carrying a bladed article and murder, and both denied the charges. Ronan's family, who were being supported by specially trained officers, issued a statement. Ronan was a kind-hearted, loving, caring 16-year-old, our son and a brother who would do anything for anyone. He was a funny character who made everyone laugh around him. He is taken from us cruelly and our hearts are broken. We want everyone to pray for his soul now. We will always love you, Arson and my brother, and you will live within us now. The question everyone wanted answered was why? Why had Ronan, who had no enemies, been targeted and attacked in such a brutal fashion? Prabjit Vidisa was from Walsall and Sukhman Shergill was from nearby Willenhall. They were 2 16-year-old boys and had gone to school with Ronan. They had got into a disagreement with one of Ronan's friends over an alleged unpaid debt, something that had spilt over into school and resulted in a fight. The more the police looked at the CCTV footage, the more damning evidence they found. On the day of Ronan's death, Prabjit had gone to the local post office and picked up a machete and ninja sword that he had purchased online. He had used his mother's ID to buy them, and when he got to the post office, all he had to do was give them his name and he was handed the parcels. They did not check any ID and simply looked at him and assumed he was over the age of 25. The parcel he had collected that day was one of almost 30 weapons he had purchased online over the previous few months. He would then sell them on to people at school. After going to the post office, he had conspired with the 3 others, Sukhman, Josiah, and Joseph. It was decided they were going to pay Ronan's friend a visit and scare him into paying back the money it was alleged that he owed. And given the blades he had brought, it was evident it was going to be violent. The 4 then got into a red Vauxhall Corsa driven by Josiah, sat in the passenger seat with Joseph, and Sukhman and Prabjit were sat in the back. Just before 8:30 p.m., Ronan had almost made it home. The Corsa had been parked on Beach Avenue and Prabjit and Sukhman got out. They were then seen running towards Mount Road at 8:34 p.m. They ran after Ronan and attacked him from behind. He was stabbed twice, once in the side and once in the chest, with one of them piercing his heart. One of the stab wounds had gone 20 centimeters into his body, and the other 17 centimeters. Prabjit had been the one to deliver these fatal blows. Sukhman had brandished the weapon but not used it. As Ronan screamed out in pain, they realized they had not attacked their intended target. It was a case of mistaken identity. They proceeded to run off down the street, back to the car, leaving Ronan on his own as he lay dying. The car then pulled away and drove off towards Birmingham New Road. It would later emerge that they had seen Ronan coming out of the house where the intended victim had lived, and assumed that he was the boy they were looking for. Following this, it was now time for them to go to trial. Prosecutor David Mason KC spoke of the significant planning that had been involved, and that both Prabjit and Sukhman had discarded their black clothes, face coverings, and the weapons after Ronan was stabbed. He said that Ronan had absolutely no chance whatsoever when he was stabbed. He added he was not the intended victim. That fact makes this case even more tragic than other cases of this type. This was a brutal killing in broad daylight in a residential street in front of members of the public. Both Prabjit and Sukhman testified during the trial, and it was confirmed that Ronan was not the target. They said they had merely wanted to scare the boy who they said owed them money. Prabjit claimed that it had been an accident and he had only wanted to poke around with the sword he was carrying. He said it wasn't until Ronan was stabbed for the second time that he noticed it had actually struck him, and that it was Ronan. The prosecution hit back saying, "I would suggest you don't accidentally stab someone 20 centimeters and then 17 centimeters. Do you? I never intended for the blade to enter the body. You intended to stab that young boy, didn't you? No. I would suggest it must have been screamingly obvious, after you inflicted that first 20-centimeter wound to his abdomen, that you had done it. You must have felt it happened, didn't you? No." He also denied that he was fascinated with knives, something which had been previously claimed, but admitted he had used false IDs to buy them and then sell them on. Sukhman said he was sad and angry after learning that Ronan had been attacked, and said that he had not been in it together with Prabjit. The prosecution said there is no real evidence of any true remorse. Senior Crown Prosecutor Samantha Dixon called the attack on Ronan a horrifying act of violence and an act of cowardice. Adam Morgan, Prabjit's defense lawyer, said he is genuinely remorseful. It is something he will have to bear for the rest of his life. Timothy Hannon KC, who was Sukhman's defense lawyer, said this was a joint enterprise offense, but a distinction can be drawn between the two defendants. Mr. Vidisa was the one who actually killed Ronan. Mr. Vidisa was the one who stabbed him, not Mr. Shergill. The trial would last for 5 weeks. After 2 hours of deliberations, the jury had returned their verdict. Both Joseph Whitaker and Josiah Francis, who had been in the car that day, were acquitted of all charges. At Wolverhampton Crown Court, Prabjit Vidisa and Sukhman Shergill were found guilty of murder and were found to have acted in joint enterprise in the killing. Before they were sentenced, Mr. Justice Chaudhary lifted the restrictions that had surrounded the case due to the age of the accused, and both Prabjit and Sukhman were named in the press for the first time. Ronan's family sat and sobbed in the gallery as they wore shirts with justice for Ronan on them. Ronan's mom Pooja told the courtroom that she had replayed the last time she saw her son over and over in her mind. She spoke directly to his killers, saying, "If there is a God, they will show you the real justice my son deserves." Mr. Justice Chaudhary's sentencing remarks were televised, the first time this had ever been done at Wolverhampton Crown Court. Detective Inspector George, who had led the investigation into Ronan's murder, said following the sentencing, "The pain of losing a child is immeasurable, but to also know that he was not the intended target adds a whole new layer of grief, and I cannot begin to imagine the sorrow Ronan's family feel." 1 year on from Ronan's murder, a vigil was held to remember him. Around 70 people gathered on Mount Road, where doves were released and poems were read out. His family also started a fundraising campaign for Save the Children to help families in Yemen in his memory. A fitting tribute for someone with a heart as good as his. It was later announced that the Kanda family were going to head down to Parliament to call for tougher action to be taken against knife crime. Wolverhampton's Southeast MP Pat McFadden arranged for them to meet with the Minister of State for Crime Policing and Fire, Chris Phillip, and the Shadow Minister, Sarah Jones. Pat McFadden had been working with Ronan's family and said he hoped it would convince the members of Parliament that action is needed to try to prevent more young people losing their lives to knife crime. The government later introduced a list of weapons to be banned. The ones used in Ronan's murder were not included on the list. Pooja would later criticize Chris Phillip, saying, "This year I met with the Minister for Crime. He requested more information on the weapon used to murder my son to ensure it would be included in the ban. But here we are. This was the opportunity for the government to take real action and show empathy for thousands of families like ours. But they've completely missed it. When I saw for the first time the size of the sword, I fainted in grief," Pooja said. As Nikita said, "We need to do more to stop knife crime. You know how easy it is to acquire a knife. You can just go online and you can buy a machete. I want to call out the MPs. I want to call out the Prime Minister. I want to call out society and say that we need to do more to ensure that not another innocent life gets taken from knife crime." Pooja also wrote an open letter to the Prime Minister calling for the online sales of knives, swords, and machetes to be banned. The campaigning work Ronan's family have done to tackle knife crime is inspiring, as is their strength and resilience in the time since his death. His family will continue to fight to change the laws and change communities for the better. Speaking directly to those who carry knives, Pooja had some powerful words. Going to prison isn't some pride and joy. You are going to ruin your life, your family's life. You will have to live with the guilt for the rest of your life knowing you've killed someone. So stop now before it's too late. Don't pick up the knife. If you have a fight, talk it over, but don't pick up the knife. There are no winners in a case like this. Ronan Kanda should still be here, taking on his levels and throwing himself into adulthood. Knife crime has claimed far too many lives and ruined too many families as well. Positive steps are being taken in communities such as knife surrender schemes and amnesty bins, where people can get rid of their weapons safely. But there is still much more to be done to bring an end to knife crime. The devastation caused by the murder of Ronan Kanda is best put into words by his mother Pooja. I miss his laughter. I miss him asking me what's for dinner. I miss hugging him. I have nothing left. It's killing me to think of what happened to Ronan. I can't believe my baby went through this alone. He was my son, my baby, and for his older sister Nikita, life will never be the same, she said. I've never loved anyone as much as I love him. 62-year-old Miyuki Harwood worked as a computer systems analyst for Intel. In 2015, she relocated from Orangevale, California, to Folsom, California. In her free time, Miyuki enjoyed being outdoors. She was an experienced and knowledgeable backpacker, often choosing to go on hikes and backpacking trips by herself. In June of 2015, she embarked on a solo hike of the Grand Canyon. However, that August, Miyuki decided to join an 8-day group backpacking trip with the Sierra Club, which would take them through the Sierra National Forest and Kings Canyon National Park. She didn't know anyone else on the trip. On August 20th, the 6th day of the journey, the group hiked up Black Cat Mountain in the Sierra National Forest. Miyuki's fellow hikers last saw her around 1 p.m., but she became separated from them shortly after. When they were unable to locate her, the group contacted authorities to report her missing. 14 different agencies would eventually be a part of the effort to find Miyuki. 60 search and rescue workers combed the area for her, and search dogs, helicopters, and a drone were all utilized. The search effort was complicated by a nearby fire, referred to as the Rough Fire, which had started at the end of July and was burning just 10 miles from the search area. The fire impacted air quality and complicated helicopter flight. Miyuki's sister-in-law traveled the area during the search, and her brother flew in from Japan. Miyuki's disappearance was made even more painful for them by its timing. She went missing near the 10-year anniversary of her husband Brett's unexpected death. On August 29th, 9 days after Miyuki disappeared, a group was searching near the Courtright Reservoir when they heard the sound of a whistle in the distance. They followed the sound and finally found Miyuki, signaling help with a whistle at the bottom of a rocky ravine. She was injured and unable to walk, so she had to be airlifted out of the area. The fire made it difficult for a helicopter to land in the area, but it was eventually able to successfully reach her. Miyuki was then airlifted to Community Regional Medical Center in Fresno, where she underwent the first of 2 surgeries she would require on her legs. After she was rescued and brought to Miyuki reached the summit of the mountain with the rest of her group but wanted to get back to their campsite, so she decided to head back down the mountain alone, a decision which she regretted. She got lost and eventually fell off of a small cliff after it got dark. She hit the ground below feet first, shattering her left leg, breaking her right ankle, and sustaining a compression fracture in her spine in the process. She remained conscious and thought that if she rested where she fell overnight, she would be strong enough to make it back to the campsite the following day. In the morning, however, she realized that she was still completely unable to walk. While Miyuki was on an 8-day excursion, the trek up Black Cat Mountain was essentially a day trip for the group, and Miyuki's main large backpack was back at the campsite, and she only had what could fit in her smaller backpack with her. She had little food beyond small items like nuts and a 1-liter water bottle. The bottle was almost empty by the day after her fall, and she knew she could not survive long without finding a source of water. Luckily, she could hear the sound of water flowing nearby. She spent the next 2 days dragging herself across the ground to reach a creek. She had a water filter with her and was able to use it to refill her water bottle every day. Temperatures dropped substantially at night, and Miyuki was only wearing a medium-weight jacket. She was able to pull herself into the sunlight during the day to warm up. Miyuki knew that people were out looking for her during her ordeal. She saw and heard the search helicopters starting the day after she was separated from her group, but had no way to signal them, and they were unable to see her. She had previously heard another group of searchers calling for her and had used her whistle to try to get their attention, but they had not heard her. Miyuki's injuries were serious but not life-threatening. She had to spend some time in a physical rehabilitation center as a part of her lengthy recovery. In January of 2016, the Fresno County Sheriff's Search and Rescue Team received a commendation for their work during Miyuki's rescue. Miyuki, still requiring crutches, was in attendance at the ceremony. She was reunited with some of her rescuers, most of whom she had not seen since she was rescued. She thanked them for not giving up on her and for saving her life. 22-year-old Richelle Lloyd graduated from North Carolina State University in December of 2015. Before beginning her graduate studies in interpersonal communication at the University of Texas, she moved to New Zealand to study at University in Palmerston North for a semester. In April of 2016, her mother, Carolyn of Charlotte, North Carolina, flew to New Zealand to visit her. On April 26th, Richelle and Carolyn embarked on a hike along the Kapakapanui Track and Te Rua Forest Park, a conservation park in the Wellington region. The track takes, on average, 6 to 8 hours to hike, and one of the best viewpoints in the park is at the summit of Kapakapanui. Both mother and daughter were experienced day hikers. Richelle and Carolyn followed orange trail markers up to the summit and then spent some time enjoying the sun before heading back down. However, at some point during their descent, they started seeing blue trail markers instead of the orange ones. They decided that they must be an alternative way back down. They would later learn that they were not. The blue markers were there to track possums. 20 minutes into their hike down, Richelle and Carolyn stopped seeing the blue markers. However, the terrain they had covered was far too steep for it to be physically possible for them to go back the way they came. Therefore, they continued on, trying to get back to the main track. Richelle and Carolyn instead eventually ended up on a small ledge that overlooked a 600-foot waterfall. It was beginning to get dark, and the overnight temperature dropped down to around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Richelle and Carolyn clung onto each other to try to stay warm and held onto a tree, trying to stay awake out of fear that they would roll down the steep terrain if they fell asleep. When the sun was up enough for them to navigate through the dense vegetation that surrounded them, they climbed down the ledge. At the base of the waterfall, they found a creek and decided to follow it. Unfortunately, Richelle slipped on a rock along the creek. She fell into the cold water and hit her head on a rock underneath the water. In addition to the head injury, Richelle also had to deal with hypothermia, which quickly began to set in. She could never get dry and therefore could never get warm after the fall. Richelle and Carolyn only had a limited amount of cheese and nuts they had packed for what they had thought would be just a day trip and tried to ration their limited food supply. But the lack of proper calories made the injured Richelle even more weak. Richelle eventually could no longer see or hear and started losing feeling in one of her legs. Carolyn then carried their backpack on her front and carried her daughter on her back for as long as she could. By the third day of their ordeal, Richelle could no longer keep going. Carolyn made a makeshift campsite and a bed made out of fern fronds for her daughter. Richelle's condition deteriorated to the point where she believed herself to be close to death, and she relayed her dying wishes to her mother. As devastated as she was at the sight of seeing her child in such a condition, Carolyn was not about to give up on trying to save Richelle. Using branches and leaves, Carolyn wrote out the word help in giant letters, once in a clearing and once in an open area by the creek, in hopes that a passing aircraft would eventually see it. There were aircraft in the area, and they were there looking for Carolyn and Richelle. Carolyn's husband and Richelle's father, Barry Lloyd, was at home in North Carolina but had been in contact with his wife throughout her trip so far. He became concerned when a day passed without him hearing from her or their daughter. Local authorities also became involved when Richelle and Carolyn failed to return their rental car or check into a hotel as planned. The car was found at the conservation park 2 days after the mother and daughter began their hike, and a search began for them. All-terrain vehicles, search dogs, and helicopters were all brought in as part of the effort. Official search and rescue workers, as well as numerous volunteers, helped look for Richelle and Carolyn. Barry Lloyd remained in contact with the emergency personnel in New Zealand, and his sons had flown to Charlotte from Chicago and were getting ready to fly to New Zealand with him to help with the search. A helicopter from Amalgamated Helicopters flew search teams into the park on April 30th, leaving them at different vantage points to look for the missing mother and daughter. The pilots then flew over the area to look for Carolyn and Richelle themselves. In the process, they saw Caroline's messages and relayed the location to the search teams. On the 5th day of their ordeal, Richelle and Caroline were airlifted out of the park and taken to Wellington Hospital. While Carolyn was weak, she did not need to be admitted to the hospital. Richelle's injuries and hypothermia did require a hospital stay. She would later say that she believed she would have only survived for a few more hours had she not been rescued and given medical attention. After she was released from the hospital, Richelle remained in New Zealand to complete her semester of studies. Carolyn's brother, John Schumacher, released a statement on behalf of the family after the rescue. "My entire family wishes to express our tear-filled gratitude to all the amazing police staff, helicopter pilots, search team members, dog guides, volunteers, and news teams who kept us informed, and everyone else involved who worked so quickly and efficiently to find and save my sister and niece," it read. "What a testament the wonderful citizens of New Zealand are to the rest of the world, of how people can work together to accomplish such noble deeds. Thank God and thank you all." 77-year-old Carol Kaparsky and her 72-year-old husband, Ian Irwin, lived in Palo Alto, California. They were both respected academics. Carol was a linguist and author, and Ian was a noted Parkinson's researcher. They lived in a very tight-knit neighborhood and were very active in their community. A neighbor described them as aging hippies who had a holistic approach to most aspects of their life and were passionate about various progressive causes. In February of 2020, the couple rented a vacation cottage near Inverness in Marin County, California, through Airbnb. They had stayed in this cottage before and were familiar with the area and its nearby trails. They were due to check out of the cabin on Saturday, February 15th. However, when a housekeeper arrived to clean the cottage that day, Carol and Ian were not there, but all of their belongings, including their car, wallets, and phones were. They missed an appointment the following day and then later failed to keep plans with their family, which was highly unusual. The last sighting of the couple before their disappearance was around 4 p.m. on February 14th as they were walking along a road in Inverness. Based on where they were seen, they could have been heading to area trails in the Tamales Bay State Park or to the trails that would take them down to Tamales Bay itself. As such, both land and water searches were undertaken, lasting 10 to 12 hours per day. Helicopters, drones, and search dogs were all used. Hundreds of people looked for the missing couple in the following days. Authorities had reason to believe that Carol and Ian could still be alive even after a few days and a cold snap that had dropped the temperature to just below freezing on several of the nights they were missing. They were both experienced hikers with specialized skills. Ian had a background in mountaineering and Carol was an herbalist and mushroom hunter. Their optimism finally started to wane by February 20th, when the Marion County Sheriff's Office announced that they were considering the search a recovery effort rather than a rescue. Carol and Ian each had a son from a previous relationship, and each of them also began accepting the possibility that they might need to hold a memorial service and hoping that they could at least find bodies to bury so that they could have some sense of closure. 2 days after that announcement was made on Saturday, February 22nd, more than a week after the couple went missing, 60 people were still out searching for them. Around 10 a.m., a 3-year-old golden retriever named Groot with the California Rescue Dog Association led volunteers into an area of thick vegetation in the creek drainage leading to Shallow Beach. There they found Carol and Ian. Ian was lying on top of thorny bushes and poison oak to protect Carol, who was without shoes, from being exposed to them. Both Carol and Ian were grateful and relieved when they saw the volunteers who gave them their own gear to warm them up and enough food and water to keep them strong through their transport out of the area. They were airlifted to a local hospital where they were reunited with their sons. Despite the fact that they had both only been wearing mid-weight jackets, they only suffered from mild hypothermia. They both had numerous cuts and scratches from the dense vegetation in the woods. Carol and Ian had gone out to watch the sunset on Valentine's Day and had taken none of their hiking equipment with them because they planned to only be gone for half an hour. However, they got lost on a trail in the woods in the dark and eventually fell. They tried to continue on but became essentially trapped in the thick bramble. Carol eventually lost her shoes in deep mud and Ian lost his eyeglasses and hearing aids. They had spent the last 4 days of their ordeal in the spot where they eventually found, surviving off of muddy water from a nearby puddle and the edible parts of a nearby fern. They were not far from a road but were unable to reach it because the vegetation had grown too thick to fight through. Carol and Ian were both in good spirits as they were rescued and during their hospital stays. Their family issued a statement expressing their gratitude for all of the people who had participated in the search. Their neighbors decorated their house to welcome them home after they recovered from their 8-day ordeal. 20-year-old Heather was the oldest daughter of Terry and Debbie Elvis, who were from South Carolina. The family was extremely close, and her father later described their bond, saying, "We've always been a tight-knit family, where everybody does for everyone else." Heather had a particularly strong relationship with her father, and they communicated daily through text messages. Always fiercely independent, Heather decided after graduating from St. James High School in 2011 that she wanted to move out of the family home and share an apartment with her best friend, Brianna Worlman. Terry and Debbie fully supported her decision. At 20, Heather was working diligently as a waitress at a Scottish-themed restaurant called the Tilted Kilt in Myrtle Beach, while also studying cosmetology to pursue her lifelong dream of becoming a full-time beautician. Her younger sister, Morgan, shared her thoughts on Heather's aspirations, saying, "She loved makeup. She wanted to be in front of the camera. She didn't understand boundaries when it came to dreaming, as well as being known for her creativity and ambitious streak." Heather was very popular and well-liked around town because of her warm, carefree, and positive nature. When people talk about Heather, they smile because she was so full of personality, a friend of Heather said. Another spoke lovingly of her, saying, "I would describe Heather as outgoing, free-spirited, loving life. She always wanted to live to the fullest." By the early summer of 2013, Heather had been sharing an apartment with her best friend, Brianna, in Myrtle Beach for around a year, and her studies and life were going great. However, this would all change when a chance meeting in the Tilted Kilt would ignite a chain of events that would end in tragedy. On a warm day in June, Heather was working the day shift in the bustling restaurant. She took orders, bussed tables, and chatted with patrons as usual. While bringing trays back into the kitchen, Heather bumped into 37-year-old father of 3, Sidney Mora, a local maintenance man who ran a small business fixing malfunctioning kitchen appliances in the Myrtle Beach area. The pair got chatting, and Heather was instantly smitten. Tweeting from her account, Moonchild, Heather hinted at her new crush on the maintenance man, saying, "I got to taste for men who were older." By the end of July, she had posted a number of sexually suggestive messages on social media, directed at the guy who builds things at my job. Heather also often pointed out Sidney Moore to her friends and co-workers, telling them, "That's the guy." Sidney loved the attention from Heather and started to turn up at the restaurant more often to talk to her, and the pair were often seen giggling together in the kitchen whenever Sidney was called in to work on the appliances. By July, the relationship may have gone from an innocent crush to something more serious, when Heather put out 2 status updates a minute apart on Twitter, hinting at a possible affair between her and Sidney. "Baby did a bad thing," she wrote, "and I'm in way too deep, but watch me get deeper." Most of Heather's co-workers were by now well aware of the 20-year-old's affections for Sidney, and rumors began to circulate about the pair's affair. One of Heather's co-workers later said, "We all knew about it because people did make fun of Heather, knowing that he was a married man. Heather was made fun of a lot, and she was called multiple names by girls we worked with." One day, 2 of the girls decided to call the Tilted Kilt and pretend to be Tammy, Sidney's wife. In August, the rumors were seemingly substantiated when Sidney started hanging around the Tilted Kilt on his days off, often bringing Heather coffee and bagels or waiting around the back of the love affair, with Sydney even going so far as telling acquaintances he was considering employing Heather as a full-time nanny for his children when he and his wife possibly moved to Florida in the future. Heather also mentioned to her friends that Sydney had asked her to be the nanny for his children, which they all felt was strange considering they appeared to be having a sexual relationship. Heather and Sydney communicated via mobile phone constantly and would often drive their cars to remote and isolated locations to meet each other for sex. It was a toxic roller coaster of emotions for Heather. Sydney often told her he was unhappy with his wife and was planning on leaving her, which he never did. Heather's friends warned her that the older married man was stringing her along. By mid-September of that year, all of the secrecy and sneaking around had started to take its toll on her, and on September 21st, it is believed that Heather attempted to bring an end to the affair or the relationship shut down somehow due to Heather tweeting, "Once upon a time an angel and a devil fell in love." It did not end well. Things became even more toxic when Sydney's wife, 34-year-old Tammy, finally discovered the relationship and confronted Heather over the phone. According to Heather's housemate Brianna, who was present at the time of the phone call, Tammy belittled Heather and said that Sydney had just used her as a booty call. The enraged woman then made her husband speak to Heather on the phone. Brianna would later tell investigators that Sydney had shouted down the phone at Heather, "You were nothing to me. You were just someone who spread your legs." They basically tore Heather apart as a human being and who she was as a person and made her feel horrible about herself, Brianna added. Tammy and Sydney Moore's marriage was seemingly an extremely abusive one, with criminal prosecutor Chris Helms later telling reporters Tammy Moore was definitely the more domineering part of that couple. She told Sydney where to work, when to work, what to do. If I could classify Sydney as anything in that relationship, it would be utterly submissive. Chris Helms also stated that Tammy had been livid at the betrayal and wasn't content to simply end the young girl's relationship with her husband. She wanted to destroy Heather's life. It was also around this time that Tammy began handcuffing her husband to the bed at night to stop him from leaving while she slept. She also changed the passcode on his phone to a combination only she knew and bullied him into getting her name tattooed across his lower stomach, just above the crotch. Sydney had agreed to all of these extreme demands in the hopes of saving his marriage and keeping his family together. According to Brianna, Tammy's attacks didn't end with that phone call, but instead escalated into a full-on campaign of hate, Tammy even going so far as to continuously call Heather's workplace in an attempt to get her fired. Tammy was relentless. She would call off of Sydney's phone. She was sending pictures of her and Sydney performing sexual acts, videos of the two of them together. Heather sent a text message to Sydney, begging him to make his wife stop the harassment, writing, "I lost hours today because they sent me home after she kept calling." Heartbroken and devastated by the way she had been treated by the man she had fallen in love with, and terrified by the constant attacks and harassment from his wife, Heather desperately tried to get her life back on track. She even started attending church again with best friend Brianna. When Tammy sent yet more aggressive and threatening messages to Heather in the beginning of November, saying, "You can tell me where you are right now or I will find out another way. That way won't have a great turnout for you. I'm giving you one last chance to answer before we meet in person. Only one." She also said, "I've been having Sydney followed since January 2012. It's best you call and speak to me. Save yourself. Hey sweetie, you ready to meet the missus?" Heather, by now mentally and physically exhausted by the ordeal, simply replied, "I think you're a little obsessed with me. I'm nobody you need to worry about anymore." Heather couldn't understand why Tammy wouldn't just leave her alone. The relationship with Sydney was over and she just wanted to forget about it all. Towards the end of November, just over 2 weeks after the last threatening text messages from Tammy, things finally started to look more positive for Heather. Sydney and Tammy had taken their 3 children on a 3-week road trip across California with their newly purchased Ford F-150 truck. With the Moores gone, Heather felt like she could momentarily relax and breathe again. There would be a reprieve from Tammy's constant harassment. That wasn't the only positive thing happening in Heather's life at that time too. She had managed to secure her dream job in a beauty salon as a makeup artist and was scheduled to start work just before Christmas. She was absolutely elated and couldn't stop talking about it with all of her friends and family. Heather was also extremely worried about something that had potential to make the whole situation with the Moores much, much worse. At the beginning of November, Heather, as well as her co-workers at the Tilted Kilt, had started to notice the 20-year-old gaining a significant amount of weight in a very short amount of time. Heather was extremely concerned that she had become pregnant by Sydney. Worried sick and frightened, she decided to take a pregnancy test at the restaurant with the help of her manager, Jessica Cook, who later told police that Heather was terrified of Tammy Moore. The pregnancy test came back as an error, however, and Heather remained unsure if she was carrying Sydney's baby or not. Heather's best friend later said, Heather had taken a pregnancy test while at work. I want to say it was at the beginning of November, and she, at that time, wasn't sleeping with anyone else other than Sydney. Despite all of her worries, by the winter of 2013, Heather, ever the optimist, decided it was finally time to move on with her life and start again. She hoped to find a new relationship, a happier and healthier one, and so she agreed to go on a first date with a man she had only been talking to for a short while, but who she had a really good feeling about, Steve Scaraldi. On the evening of December 17th, Heather and Steve met at around 10 p.m. and decided to drive around Myrtle Beach to check out the local Christmas illuminations in town. A little while later, they decided to head to a nearby parking lot where Steve taught Heather how to drive his manual vehicle. Heather excitedly sent a text message to her father and Brianna with a smiling photograph saying, "Just learnt to drive stick. I'm a pro." After, Steve would later say that the pair had agreed to meet again for a second date, and then he dropped Heather off at her apartment in Carolina Forest at around 1:15 a.m. At around 1:45 a.m., Brianna, Heather's best friend, received a worrying phone call from Heather. She was hysterically crying and she said, "Sydney called me. My heart dropped because I was like, I thought we were past this." I said, "Why did you answer?" And she said, "Because it wasn't his number." She told me that he said he had left his wife and that he was sorry and that he wanted to see her and be with her. And I got angry and said, "Don't do it. You're finally moving on with your life. You're happy again. You're yourself again. Why don't you sleep? Sleep on this and we'll talk about it first thing in the morning." And with that, the friends said their goodbyes. The following day, on December 19th, local police were dispatched to investigate a suspected abandoned vehicle, a green Dodge Intrepid, parked haphazardly on an isolated and remote Riverside area named Peachtree Landing, approximately 8 miles away from Myrtle Beach and on the Whatcomar River. The stretch of riverfront was used as a landing area for small boats and was located at the bottom of a long and lonely stretch of road that rarely saw traffic. The car was locked, but police ran the vehicle's number plate through their registration system and came back with the name of the owner. The green Dodge Intrepid was registered to Terry Elvis, Heather's father. Terry Elvis was relaxing at home and watching television on the living room sofa when police officers knocked on his door to notify him about the discovery of the Dodge Intrepid. Confused and not being able to contact his daughter on her phone, he agreed to accompany the officers to Peachtree Landing to find out what was going on. When he spotted Heather's car parked unusually in the isolated area, he was shocked, but not initially concerned. He unlocked the vehicle with a spare key he had and allowed the officers to search it. He recalled, "I thought the car might have been stolen because of the way it was parked. Maybe somebody took it and left it there," he said. "It didn't really hit me. Where's Heather?" Until the officers started looking through things. When the police couldn't locate Heather's purse, keys, or cell phone within the Dodge Intrepid, her father began to worry. He tried calling her again on her mobile phone, which appeared to be switched off, and then attempted to locate her at the Tilted Kilt, but was told by staff that she wasn't there and wasn't scheduled to work until the next day. Terry instantly knew that something was wrong. "This is totally out of the ordinary," he said. "Heather's never done anything like this before. Something's wrong." The Horry Police Department didn't think Peachtree Landing and the vehicle were crime scenes initially, as there was no broken glass, no signs of a struggle, and no blood in the area. However, they did open a missing persons case immediately, and officers and volunteers began searching the areas around Peachtree Landing while divers combed the river. Human remains were discovered in the proximity of the boat landing. However, analysis later showed that these bones belonged to a male. With no physical evidence to go on, detectives began tracing Heather's movements on 17th December 18th. Steve Scaraldi, the man who Heather had met on the night she was last seen, was brought in for questioning, but quickly cleared of all suspicion and released. To the shock of Heather's family and friends, who were putting out heartfelt and emotional pleas for information, as well as rewards, in the immediate aftermath of Heather's disappearance, Tammy Mora immediately jumped on social media to continue her hate campaign, publishing on Facebook a long diatribe that began, "While Sydney cheated on me in the months of September-October with a psycho whore who has since went missing." On December 20th, after being tipped off about the volatile love affair between Sydney and Heather by Heather's roommate Brianna, as well as a number of employees at the Tilted Kilt, police detectives brought Sydney in for questioning. Sydney was evasive and standoffish from the onset of the interviews. Sydney denied being anywhere near Peachtree Landing on the night of 17th or the morning of 18th. He insisted he hadn't had any kind of contact with Heather at all, and strangely insisted he was driving around in his truck with his wife Tammy at the time to have sexual relations in public, which the pair had recorded on their phones. The experienced detectives felt that he was lying. They just needed the proof. When they began to examine Heather's call history and phone records, they got their first real breaks in the case, and began piecing together her last known movements and how Sydney featured in those. On the morning of 18th, just as Brianna had described, Heather had received a telephone call from a number she didn't recognize. She didn't recognize the number because it was placed from a public payphone. That telephone call lasted approximately 5 minutes, and Heather had frantically attempted to call the number back numerous times, starting from 1:35 in the morning. Heather dials the payphone back 9 times. The only reason she could possibly be calling that phone 9 times, that phone she's never heard of before, is to get the other person that just talked back on the line, an investigator would later say. Using Heather's phone records, the investigators traced the number to a phone booth located outside a gas station in Myrtle Beach. Security cameras picked up the images of someone using the payphone at the exact time the number called Heather's cell phone. When asked if he was the person who had called her, Sydney at first denied it. Tammy Mora was also taken in for questioning, where she discussed her marriage and denied being involved in Heather's disappearance. Following their suspicions, detectives decided to check all available local surveillance cameras and quickly came upon further highly incriminating evidence. A short time before making the telephone call, Sydney was captured again on surveillance cameras, purchasing a pregnancy test from a local Walmart. When asked if the pregnancy test was for Heather, he denied it and said it was for his wife. Even more damning evidence to come to light was video footage taken from cameras alongside the isolated stretch of road leading to Peachtree Landing. A dark Ford F-150 truck, matching Sydney's, had been captured heading towards the place Heather's car was discovered at 3:36 a.m., and then again recorded leaving the area at 3:46 a.m. Experts later testified that the truck was a 100% identical match to Sydney's. Sydney was the last person to speak to Heather, and he was, investigators believed, the last person to see her in Peachtree Landing. Using her phone data, investigators were also able to create a timeline of her phone's last known recorded movements. 2:30 a.m. Heather's phone again calls the phone booth that Sydney had called her from, but receives no answer. Her phone then heads in the direction of Longbeard's Bar and Grill in Carolina Forest, near to her apartment where it remains for around 15 minutes, to a location named Augusta Plantation Drive. Heather's phone then returns to Longbeard's Bar and Grill, where it remains for a further 15 minutes. A call is made to Sydney's phone but goes unanswered. Her phone returns to her apartment where it stays for 5 minutes. 3:25 a.m. Another call is made to Sydney's phone, which is answered and results in a 4-minute-long conversation. 3:37 a.m. Heather's phone makes its way to Peachtree Landing, and 1 minute later 3 attempts are made to call Sydney's phone. All calls go unanswered. 3:41 a.m. Another unsuccessful attempt is made from Heather's phone to reach Sydney's. 3:42 a.m. Heather's phone is apparently switched off. The location data coinciding with the surveillance images captured of Sydney's truck heading towards Peachtree Landing were extremely incriminating. Even more incriminating evidence came to light after investigators obtained a search warrant for the Moras' home. The Moras had suspiciously disposed of their home surveillance system on December 20th and installed a new one on 21st. Investigators, unable to get their hands on the old system, confiscated the newer system and received video footage of both Sydney and Tammy Mora thoroughly scrubbing the passenger side of the truck and then burning the rags they had used to clean the vehicle on the same day they had installed the new home surveillance cameras. Finally, after several months in February 2014, the police were able to announce a break in the case. A break that everyone had been waiting for. And it came as little surprise to many people that Sydney and Tammy Mora had been placed under arrest in connection with the disappearance of Heather Elvis. They were soon charged with kidnap, and despite there being nobody, they were charged with murder as well. They needed to find Heather, but the couple were saying nothing. As the Moores sat in custody, the police continued to build their case. Despite everything they were confident they had, they just didn't have enough to follow through with the murder charge against the pair. Tammy and Sydney no longer faced charges of murder in Heather's case, but the kidnap charges remained. Debbie said it was very disappointing that the murder charges had been dropped, but she also felt a little relieved that she would not have to sit through a murder trial and listen to everything they thought could have happened to her daughter play out. Heather's family also hoped that this might encourage people to come forward and talk. As the murder charges had now been dropped, the couple were able to post bail and go home as they awaited further developments and the pending trial for kidnap. Following their release, and in spite of a gag order, the pair took to social media to protest their innocence, claimed they had been framed, and Sydney Moore even gave an emotional televised interview. Sydney's media appearances and failure to comply with the gag order would eventually land him in hot water when he was jailed for 5 months for being in contempt and violating the order. Tammy publicly stated, "I feel like this town's gonna crucify me because of all the lies that's happened." Months became years, and it was now 2017. Sydney Mora was found guilty of obstruction of justice and sentenced to 10 years in prison. After this, it was now time for Sydney and Tammy to go on trial for the kidnap of Heather Elvis. And the media were out in force to report on what was now a highly publicized case with a lot of interest. It had now been 6 years since anyone last saw Heather. And after many witness testimonies, all the evidence, and hours of court proceedings taking us to 2019, it was time for the verdict. Justice finally prevailed when Tammy and Sydney Mora were both found guilty of the kidnap of Heather Elvis and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Sydney continued to insist he was innocent, telling the court that he couldn't give Heather's family closure. "If I could give them closure, I would. I have children of my own. I get it. There's just nothing I can give." As of the writing of this episode, Heather's body has never been found. In an effort to ensure that people will always remember Heather and draw attention to her case and other missing people, the Elvis family spends every June 30th, Heather's birthday, taping up missing persons flyers around town. They remain hopeful that at some point someone will talk, and maybe the answers about where Heather is will finally come to light. Debbie said persistence is key, and she would never give up her search for answers, not just for her own daughter, but for other missing people too. She says she knows the pain all too well and wants to channel her energy into making sure those in her position don't ever feel alone. The heartbreak of not knowing where Heather is best summed up by Debbie. As a mother, that child that was created in you, that you carried in your arms and put band-aids on, you just ache to hold your child again. And you think about what you could have done different, what you could have said that would have changed anything. But for our family and any other family that has a missing member, this is horrible not knowing. Not being able to take care of your child in any capacity whatsoever. They call it closure. I hate that word, but that's really what it is. For Heather's heartbroken father, Terry, he continues to hope that one day she will be found. He said, "I hold out hope that I'll turn around one day at the front door and she'll walk in. Do I really think that'll happen? Deep down, no, I don't, but I'll never give up." This story begins on March 25, 1989, when Carolyn Downs and her husband Robert, known as Bob, welcomed their daughter Charlene, their third child. Charlene had 2 older sisters, Rebecca, called Becky, and Emma. She was later followed by the youngest of the Downs children, their only son, Robert. Charlene was known for her love of music and animals, and she was close to her siblings, with a cheeky and humorous side. Bob and Karen had married on May 2, 1987, at a church in Hillfields, just north of Coventry's city center. Hillfields was one of the more deprived areas of the city, marked by high levels of antisocial behavior and crime. Life in the Downs household could be described as chaotic and dysfunctional, often leading to run-ins with the police and social services. Those who knew the couple made allegations that Bob struggled with alcohol addiction and displayed violent and aggressive behavior toward his children. A court document from 1989 revealed that the family was under investigation by social services and West Midlands police. It was discovered that a convicted rapist had been found with 3-year-old Emma in his car without supervision and had also been inside the Downs family home. Bob was given the advice that the person in question should not be allowed into the family home again. But this didn't happen, and Bob continued to have drinks with the individual in the pub. The police conducted a video interview with Emma in the hope it would unveil something more, but she disclosed nothing. She would later move out of the family home and in 1993 moved in with her grandfather and his wife. After Emma moved back to the family home in 1997, allegations of sexual assault were made against a family friend. Allegations also made by Charlene. The friend was allegedly trusted by the family to take the children to school in the morning. And a report from social services states that it was believed Karen and Bob were aware of the abuse but failed to act. When Charlene was 9 years old, an allegation was made that a friend of her parents had forced themselves on her. Now, at the risk of the children being removed from the home and taken into the care of social services and the potential prosecution for neglect, in 1999 the family moved out of Coventry and up north to Blackpool. For many, Blackpool brings back memories of the illuminations, arcades, and ice creams on the beach. During the day, the piers, promenade, and beach are full of tourists looking for some time away. Home to the Blackpool Tower and the Tower Ballroom, many a famous face is performed in the town. Everyone from Frank Sinatra to the Beatles. Thousands of people visit Blackpool every year during the summer months and tourist season, especially for the illuminations switch on. But behind the bright lights lies a very different town. A large proportion of those who live there live in deprived areas, and it is the 6th most deprived authority in England. There are high amounts of unemployment, and the death rate of those who die from alcohol-related deaths is the highest in England. There are also high levels of poverty, and the town is the 12th poorest area in the whole country. As concerns over the welfare of the children continued to grow, Charlene, Emma, and Becky were placed in foster care after they said they no longer wanted to be at home. This placement did not last for an extended period of time, and the children were returned to the house. In 1999, Becky Downs alleged that her father was violent, and social services said they were going to take it to court to try and obtain a prosecution. By the end of 1999, the children were put on the at-risk register, and it was reported that domestic violence was present in the home. One of Charlene's friends, Martin, said he not only saw Bob's violence, but also predators at the Downs house. By early 2000, at the age of 11, Charlene was staying at different homes and told the workers from social services that she was being beaten by her parents, showing them bruises. In March of that year, Charlene's school began to raise concerns that she was failing to attend classes and wasn't coming to school. Her parents said they didn't know where she was as she stayed with many different people. A few months later, in June, Charlene was examined by the hospital, and based on what it found, it was suspected that she was the victim of sexual abuse. She made the allegation that her father had become violent and thrown her across the room. Following this, she disappeared for 2 days. Over the course of a 12-month period, Charlene would make 13 visits to a sexual health clinic with her grandmother. She had bruising on her body, including her inner thigh. Social services spoke to Bob about their concerns that Emma had been seen with older men in the family home, and Bob later moved out to appease those from social services. He moved to Buchanan Street in September and took Charlene and her brother Robert out of the care of social services and against the wishes of the authorities. As 2001 rolled around, social services suspected that a male was in the family home and sharing a bed with Charlene. In April of that year, there were more allegations made by Becky and Charlene regarding Bob's excessive drinking and the men he used to bring to the house, and the inappropriate sexual advances these men would make. Charlene allegedly told a social worker that one of her father's friends had touched her inappropriately. When health visitors made a visit to the family home in August, Charlene was found in bed with a much older man, as she counted some money. But Bob and Karen said he was just a family friend. 1 month later, Becky would move out. Over a period of 15 years, 16 men who had committed a variety of offenses against minors had access to the family homes both in Coventry and in Blackpool. Bob and Karen denied letting predators stay at their home. Bob would drink at various pubs in and around Blackpool. During one of his visits to the pub, he met a man called Ray Monroe, and he invited him back to the house. Ray Monroe would end up staying at the property. Monroe is a convicted sex offender with 4 counts of sexual assault against young girls, and he was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. Karen and Bob said they were unaware of this and only found out when the details came out in court. They said they believed he had raped an ex-girlfriend, information which did not stop them from allowing him into their home. One of Bob's friends, Glenn, claimed he saw Bob invite various men from the pub back to his house, and that he had seen Charlene sitting on Monroe's lap. He said he voiced his concerns about seeing this and said that it wasn't right. In 2003, Charlene visited a walk-in health center 3 times. Karen claimed to be unaware of Charlene going to the health clinic and also unaware of the predator staying in her home. Despite moving to a different part of the country, it seemed that not much had changed, and family life was still fractured and difficult. The November 3, 2003, the police conducted a search of the family home and found nothing relating to Charlene or anything that gave any clues as to where she might have gone. They needed to work backwards. What follows is a timeline of what is believed to be Charlene's last known movements, although the details of this remain debated and there are differing opinions as to where she went that night. As part of this documentary, we went to Blackpool and met with Renee Crompton, who runs the Justice for Charlene Downs campaign. She walked us through the route that Charlene is believed to have taken that night. This timeline is also compiled using the timeline issued by Lancashire Police. But again, it's important to remember that the details do differ. The November 1, 2003, at 3:25 p.m., Charlene and Becky were walking down Bank Hay Street to get to the Coral Island Arcade. Charlene's friend Tasha corroborated this and said she had seen her there too. According to the police timeline, Charlene returned to the family home before going back out later in the evening. It is believed that Charlene and Becky went to the McDonald's close to the promenade later that evening. The pair then headed to Church Street and walked up it at around 6:45 p.m. It's alleged that they met with Karen Downs as she handed out leaflets for the restaurant she worked at, which was located on Church Street. Charlene then headed to a phone box on Leopold Grove before saying goodbye to her mother and going off with her friends. It's reported that Karen Downs gave them money. According to the police timeline, Charlene stayed with her friends for a while before setting off to Court Street, and the details of what she did in the following hour are not known. But according to the police, she met another friend. Charlene and her friend Tyne went to the Carousel Bar at 9:30 p.m., where Tyne said men bought the pair of drinks before Tyne lost sight of her. She said she never saw Charlene again. This does differ from the police timeline, which says they went back into town before going their separate ways near Abington Street and Talbot Street at 11 p.m. The last claimed sighting of Charlene was in an alleyway off of Abingdon Street at 11 p.m. This alleyway is somewhat notorious in Blackpool. Various takeaways back onto it, and young girls in the town would often use the alley to go into the shops via the back doors, later returning with things like money and cigarettes. Charlene had been expelled from school, and as she was now lacking in structure and routine, she would spend more time in the town center and in the alleyway. As the investigation continued, there was no sign of Charlene Downs. Missing persons posters were put up and people were hoping for any news of her whereabouts. But the investigation soon stalled and the leads were proving fruitless. Then, more than a year later, in November 2004, someone would come forward and the case would take a dramatic turn. A man called David Cassidy came forward to the police with a disturbing story to tell. David Cassidy owned a local business that supplied slot machines to shops in the area. He said that a man called Tariq had claimed his brother, Ayed al-Batiki, had confessed to murdering Charlene, and that another man called Mohammed Ravshir had helped him to cover it up. Mohammed Ravshir had been born in Iran before moving to the UK. He owned and operated Funny Boys fast food on Dixon Road, which is how he knew David Cassidy. One of his employees was his friend and tenant, Ayed al-Batiki, who was originally from Jordan. This was the break that the police had been looking for. They asked David if he would wear a concealed microphone and talk to Tarek again, to ensure that the conversation was recorded. David agreed. In the recording, Tarek is heard saying he never said those things, adding that it was bullshit. The police would later insist they had never seen or heard this recording. In January 2005, the police conducted a search of the home of Mohammed Raveshi, but nothing of note was found. On February 22nd, Mohammed and Ayed were brought in for informal questioning. And whilst this was taking place, wiretaps were put in place to record conversations as part of a covert operation. During the operations, Mohammed could be heard speaking to somebody about David Cassidy. They joked that he should be killed and then turned into a kebab. Mohammed's friend says, "You have a kebab shop. Sell it." Mohammed laughs and replies, "Yeah, make a fake little kebab." While the police were conducting their covert operations, a woman whose identity is protected said she had gone into Funny Boys for a coffee after having a few drinks at another establishment. She said she had then woken up in the upstairs flat. She was on a bed with no clothes on. She could not recall how she had come to be in the flat or why she was naked. She said she quickly got dressed and ran out of the building down the alley. She stated she heard a man calling out to her and asking her to come back. When she looked back at him, she said he was holding some money in his hand. She went to the police to report the incident, and the police allegedly told her that the person responsible was Ayad al-Batiki and that he had raped her and filmed it. The woman also claimed that two police officers, Jan Besson and Don Fraser, asked her to make claims that she couldn't be sure were true. She refused and her case was dropped. No investigation was undertaken and charges were not filed. Covert recordings were made over 4 weeks and produced 52 CDs in total. However, officers would later describe the recordings as too distorted to use. One of the officers working on the case was Jan Besant, a detective sergeant. She offered to transcribe the tapes and would spend the next 2 years doing this. As well as running the takeaway business, Mohammed used to be a foster father for vulnerable children in Blackpool. Jan Besson questioned one of Mohammed's former foster daughters, and she confirmed that there was nothing untoward about him and offered no incriminating or otherwise suspicious stories about him. However, one of Mohammed's ex-foster daughters would later accuse him of sexual assault. Mohammed also lived 2 doors down from Don Fraser. He was also working on Charlene's case. Mohammed alleged that Don's wife had said that Don had difficulty performing in the bedroom and that she had made a pass at Mohammed. Mohammed said he turned her down and this situation was the root cause of Don's issues with him and their falling out. This story was very different from Don's. Don later claimed that his relationship with Mohammed had fallen apart after hearing that Mohammed had shown a pornographic video to underage girls in his home. He added that his wife had never liked Mohammed. These are allegations that Mohammed refuted. With still no sign of Charlene, the police changed their strategy. This was no longer a missing persons case. This was now a murder inquiry. March 17, 2006. It was reported that 2 people had been arrested. Ayed al-Batiki had been charged with murdering Charlene Downs, and Mohammed Raveshir was charged with helping him dispose of her body. In May 2007 at Preston Crown Court, Mohammed Raveshi and Ayed al-Batiki went on trial. The prosecution claimed that either Mohammed or Ayed had been having a sexual relationship with Charlene, and that if the police had found out, they would have been in trouble. But both men said they didn't even know her, let alone have a sexual relationship with her. However, multiple people would later state that they had seen Charlene behind the counter at the takeaway shop, as well as experiencing inappropriate behavior. Emma Downs described Ayed as a creep and said she had seen him behaving badly in nightclubs towards young girls. The police also claimed that there had been multiple allegations of sexual assault lodged against Ayed. Mohammed's house had been searched extensively. Carpets and floorboards were removed and the property was gone through with a fine-tooth comb. No DNA evidence was found. The police said that the house had been cleaned, but Mohammed argued that there was no evidence for them to find there in the first place. The defense requested that the audio recording of the conversation between David and Tarek be submitted, only to be told it couldn't be found. The court then ordered that the police needed to find the audio and give it to them, and the CD was subsequently found. but it had a huge scratch on it. And as a result, the police said they believed it wouldn't be playable. Jan Besson would later claim that if the audio CD had been properly declared, approval would not have been given to search Muhammad's home, nor to putting the recording devices in place. Don Fraser's account had been the one to enter the audio CD of the conversation with Tariq into the system. But he said this was not him and that he had been framed by someone else using his PC and log on details. He would later say, "To say my heart sank when I heard this tape is an understatement. I didn't know anything about these CDs from 2005. I haven't got a clue what happened." During the proceedings, the covert recordings were played to the court, and the transcriptions made by Detective Sergeant Jan Besant were the captions. Claims were made during the trial that after Charlene had been murdered, her body had been dismembered and put into kebabs in the takeaway, and that her bones had been crushed up and put into the grouting. There is no evidence for either of these things happening. This narrative has been pushed and repeated when discussing Charlene's case, in spite of the lack of evidence to back it up, reducing Charlene to nothing more than a cruel urban legend. After the defense and prosecution presented their cases, it was time for the jury to deliberate. After 49 hours of discussions, they had failed to come to a verdict. As a result, the jury was formally discharged. On September 15th that year, a memorial was held for Charlene, which was funded by the far-right British National Party. An inquiry was also set up by the Independent Police Complaints Commission, and it found that the investigation into Charlene's disappearance was handled unprofessionally. This led to 2 officers facing disciplinary action, and one of them subsequently being cleared of any wrongdoing. In April 2008, a retrial was ordered, but this would soon come to a grinding halt and later totally collapse. The Crown Prosecution Service, upon re-examining the evidence, found that there were serious issues with the evidence presented and that they had grave doubts about how reliable some of the evidence was. The covert recordings were criticized for their poor quality, and the accuracy of the transcriptions made by Jan Besant was described as low. Mohammed Raveshi's lawyer, John Bromley Davenport, said that Detective Sergeant Besant was not qualified to listen to and transcribe the tapes. An expert would later re-examine the audio tapes of the covert recordings after they had been played to the court, and they too said they were not of a good enough quality to be evidence. It also found that some of the transcriptions were different words. For example, one phrase was transcribed as burial place, but it was argued what had actually been said was Paul's place. The tracker that had been put onto Muhammad's car then showed him going to see one of his friends, who was named Paul. Forensic audiologist Elizabeth McClellan said that Jan Besant's transcript should not have been used during the trial. She said, "This is a classic case of cognitive priming. The evidence presented by Jan Besant was potentially misleading. It's extremely important that when recordings are transcribed that the person transcribing them has no prior awareness at all about that evidence. In this case, it shows several signs that she was subject to bias and influenced by the events that she was investigating." Both men were subsequently released. The charges against Ed and Muhammad were dropped. They were acquitted and given £250,000 in compensation. Muhammad indicated upon his release that he would potentially sue the police force, describing what had happened to him as shameful, having spent more than 2 years on remand in prison. Muhammad said that David Cassidy, who had made the statement that had led to the police looking into him and Ayed, had worked for him at one point, but he had been forced to let him go as he was bad at his job. David was enraged by being fired and proceeded to harass Muhammad as well as vandalize the shop. Tensions reached a boiling point when the pair ended up having a physical altercation. It was after this that David gave his statements to the police regarding what had allegedly been said to him. In 2011, Jan Besant was found guilty of 2 counts of misconduct and was forced to resign from the police force. Lancashire Police said her conduct had let everyone down. The IPCC Commissioner for the Northwest, Nasim Malik, said, "It was abundantly clear that the covert recordings and the investigation had been handled poorly and unprofessionally." Superintendent Simon Giles said that the police expect the highest professional standards from all our staff, and the panel has found that this individual's conduct has fallen well short of these standards. The ruling that Jan Besant be forced to resign was later overturned by the British Arbitration Tribunal, and they said she should be reinstated. The years would pass. Tourists would come and go, and the town would carry on. But there was still no sign of Charlene Downs. It had now been 8 years since Charlene had vanished from the streets of Blackpool. The police looking into her case found that more than 60 teenage girls had been the victims of grooming by people working in various takeaway shops throughout the town. Charlene's friend Tasha said that she had seen grooming in Blackpool firsthand and had also been groomed. Charlene's friend Martin and another friend Sean said that they had witnessed Charlene going into takeaway shops and then coming back out with cigarettes, money, or alcohol. Charlene's friend Tyne said that she too would go into the alleyway and trade sexual contact for drugs, cigarettes, money, and alcohol. Tyne said on the occasion she went to the alleyway with Charlene. Charlene would act as a lookout in case the police came, and Tyne would give her money for doing this. Paige Chivers was a 15-year-old girl who went missing from Blackpool 4 years after Charlene. Robert Ewing was later convicted and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 33 years. He had murdered her after she had threatened to go to the police and tell them about the sexual contact he had had with her. Ewing, a self-confessed neo-Nazi, had been previously convicted for gross indecency and indecent assault against a 12-year-old girl. In 2014, a Crime Watch appeal was launched, and a reward for any fruitful information was offered totaling £100,000 in 2016. A cold case team was brought on board to examine Charlene's case, and they found CCTV that had previously not been released to the public. It showed Charlene and Becky walking on the day Charlene had gone missing. It was released to the public in November of that year to try and generate any new leads. And a Crime Watch appeal was issued again on the 13th anniversary of her going missing. In 2017, Karen and Bob Downs sued Lancashire police over their handling of their daughter's case. And the CCTV footage. August 2017. An arrest was made. A man was taken into custody on suspicion of the murder of Charlene Downs. Nigel had worked as a chef, and a restaurant he worked at in Blackpool appeared on an episode of Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares. Clubway 41. Nigel Lloyd had attacked two 15-year-old girls in Blackpool in 2001 and 2003. He was convicted of these in 2017 and sentenced to 64 months, more than 5 years, in prison. The flat Nigel was living in overlooked the alleyway Charlene would often be seen in and where she had allegedly been on the night she disappeared. Tyne said she knew Nigel Lloyd and referred to him as a creep. He also knew Charlene and her family. He was released after 2 days without charge, and no charges have ever been filed against him in relation to Charlene's disappearance. In November 2018, Bob and Karen appeared on The Jeremy Kyle Show, a controversial British talk show where guests would appear to resolve conflicts, take lie detector tests and DNA tests. There would be frequent confrontations and arguments on stage. Bob Downs later said they had appeared on the show to discuss Charlene's case, but it quickly devolved into talking about their marriage and marital problems. Also that year, Karen Downs released a book called Sold in Secret talking about Charlene and her disappearance. In 2021, Charlene's brother Robert tragically passed away. He was found in a pool of blood by Bob on the December 4th at 11:30 p.m. A few hours before he had complained he felt unwell. His family said he had been left deeply affected by the disappearance of his sister and had never been able to properly process or recover from it. At an inquest, it was ruled he had died of an accidental drugs overdose. It also came out that Bob and Karen did not call the ambulance for 3 hours. They said after finding him, they had fallen into a state of panic and anxiety. The ambulance wasn't called until nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. In November the following year, Charlene's friend, Tyne, died at the age of 32. An inquest found her death was drug-related. In 2023, the case was reopened by the Leeds Trinity University Cold Case Unit teamed up with Renee in the hopes of finally solving Charlene's case. Renee said, "Our main aim is to review Charlene's case and see where the failings are and go out to get new evidence." Blackburn Uni also approached us to undertake a large child sexual exploitation project for the whole of Lancashire, to find out the scale of the problem and where children are being failed. Bob and Karen said they have been verbally abused and taunted by locals after it came out that Raymond Rowe and other predators had stayed at their house. Bob again asserted he didn't know Raymond Rowe was a pedophile. They remain living in Blackpool. Unfortunately, Charlene's story is not unique. There are a plethora of young people who constantly fall through the cracks, and the people that should be there to catch them aren't. An internal police report would state that 11 takeaway shops in Blackpool Town Centre had been involved in sexually exploiting young girls. As reported by the BBC, the Times newspaper conducted an investigation that found the police initially had 100 people of interest due to how many people were believed to be abusing and exploiting Charlene. And that brings us to today. Today marks the 20th anniversary of Charlene's disappearance. And there are still more questions than answers. The investigation into what happened to her is one of the longest running in Lancashire, with 1,000 statements being taken and more than 3,000 people being spoken to. This is about getting justice for a 14-year-old girl. She was someone who had already gone through so much in such a short period of time. And the least we can do is continue to fight for her. As Renee said, Charlene was failed by everyone that should have kept her safe. The police, social services, they all let her down. We're trying to build a legacy and fight for real justice for her, so she can be remembered for something positive. It is our hope that those who know more will come forward with the truth. Her whereabouts will finally be made known, and justice will be served. If you have any information relating to the disappearance or whereabouts of Charlene Downs, please contact Lancashire Police. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.